Ferens, candidate of political sciences, founder of the social democratic platform Public Organization, joins the Freedom Studio. Good morning, Bohdan. Glad to see you.
Greetings.
Greetings, good morning.
Bohdan, in your opinion, is Beijing's view on a peaceful settlement changing right now? And if so, how? Which side are they taking at the moment, if any? Or rather, not so much which side. Is there any change in their rhetoric? Are they still just as neutral? Or are there any changes you would like to highlight?
There are basically no changes. No changes were expected regarding how China positions itself in the context of the Russian war. Why? Because essentially it is beneficial for China when, on the one hand, Russia is at war and Russia's dependence becomes even greater. And China profits from this, unfortunately. And basically, the option where the war ends is also suitable. And in this way, China's key message that they are for peace is also fulfilled. But in particular, it's hard to say that China is making every possible effort to actually stop the Russian war. There were attempts, if you recall, after the first year of the full-scale invasion, when more countries from different regions were waiting it out. That is, they did not consider having close contacts with Putin, with the Kremlin, at least not publicly. After the first year of the full-scale war, China got involved when there was a certain vacuum in the context of mediation. That is, there were visits by the special representative to Kiev, to Moscow, and to European capitals. But again, as we now understand and can state, there was no result. As for how genuine and sincere these efforts were, with a real zeal to stop the war, I already had my doubts back then. But in terms of positioning, China further, as I said, China is already building a predictable position that peace must be sought, but at the same time, the realities of this war must be taken into account, and at the same time, China is profiting from this war, unfortunately, by persistently maintaining cooperation and sometimes even actively intensifying this cooperation with the government of the Russian Federation.
Special projects, reports from around the world, and up to date analysis. All the most important things are on your smartphone simple, fast, convenient, and free. Download the Freedom app from the App Store or Play Market. One click, and you're already at the center of events. Knowing everything with freedom is easy.
Ala Bogdan, when Xi Jinping talks about ensuring equal participation of the parties in negotiations, in your opinion, what exactly is Comrade Xi referring to in this regard? As I understand it, in order for things to be promising and effective, it's necessary to ensure equal participation of the parties. In your opinion, which parties might be meant for the future? And regarding equal participation, what exactly do you think Xi Jinping has in mind?
One aspect is when you say that things should be distributed equally, that the world should be built on interests, on balance, on understanding, and the other aspect is how it actually happens in reality. And in reality, it happens as follows: the pragmatic interests of China, its direct desire to dominate in different parts of the world, while at the same time building pragmatic relationships with various direct participants, even with the United States of America, so that they become more predictable, helps China to strengthen itself both externally and internally, thereby becoming an even greater threat to the United States of America and to NATO. The Trump administration also did not try to build these relations with China in such a pragmatic way. The conflict has not disappeared anywhere. Because on the one hand, China's ambitions, they do not intend to stop at any particular point of economic development, militarization, or the spread of economic expansion in different parts of the world. At the same time, the US can no longer compete with China the way it used to. It was much easier when the US dominated economically, primarily in technology and militarily. Therefore, we will periodically witness the clash of these interests and the definition of boundaries, along which the world will continue to move forward. And in particular, sometimes it is about avoiding excessive risks so that this conflict does not turn into a war between such serious poles of power and influence. For the state, it is important to contain China as well as the Russian Federation and not allow, especially for the West, an open military aggressive cooperation between China and the Russian Federation, because this would be even more dangerous from the perspective of global security.
Interestingly, the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, during his visits to China, called on China to use its influence on Moscow to bring about a swift end to Russia's war against Ukraine. How significant is Europe as a partner for China in this regard? To what extent does China currently listen to these recommendations? How valuable is this interaction? Are there elements where it is actually beneficial for them to listen? Are they generally likely to listen? How do things stand?
China does listen to arguments from Europe, continental, but in particular, it is guided again by its own interests and priorities. For China, the European market has always been a priority, just like the American market, first and foremost. Why is that? Because these are opportunities to earn a lot. It's technological expansion that allows them to control or influence various sectors. That's why China has always built these relationships very carefully with the European Union as well as with individual countries in continental Europe. But again, these relationships have always been subject to criticism from the United States of America. And as we've just seen, there are currently quite problematic trade relations between the US under Donald Trump, tariffs, and the European countries, the European Union. As soon as this as soon as this conflict arose again, China immediately perked up and realized that in principle, it needs to use this opportunity to strengthen its contacts and opportunities with, for example, Germany, an export-oriented country, France, if possible, Italy, and other countries. I wouldn't say that this could be a very close, consolidated form of cooperation, especially right now, because in Europe, they understand that China is also a threat from a security standpoint. Most European countries are NATO member states, and this threat from China is not going anywhere, but pragmatism has its own influence. Let me remind you, there was even a period when Germany was ready to sign a very deep cooperation agreement in the trade and economic sphere with China. But at that time, the United States influenced things in such a way that it was not implemented. So there is always interest. The main interest is, first and foremost, the sales market and the privileged civilian European vector, which allows China to earn more technologically. Expansion, which also helps to spread China's interests, but at the same time, there are restrictive measures that do not allow the Chinese to enter certain countries as freely as, for example, on other continents, such as in Africa, some Asian countries, or in Latin America.
Bogdan, let's talk about the opinions that exist regarding what plans Xi Jinping and Putin are hatching in general and their prospects. Putin and Xi know that they will be able to outlast Donald Trump and continue implementing their own plans, and then, writes the Times. Analysts from the publication note that the alliance between Beijing and Moscow has noticeably strengthened since the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. Despite claims of supposed neutrality, China is in fact supporting the Russian economy, which has allowed it to soften the impact of Western sanctions. Xi Jinping and the Russian dictator Putin regularly hold meetings and coordinate their actions. Moscow and Beijing have announced plans to increase their influence in the Arctic and are also participating in joint military exercises with Iran near the Strait of Hormuz. The publication notes that China is not interested in Russia's defeat, but also does not want to see it as an equal to itself. At the same time, both Xi and Putin consider their lack of real political competition within their countries and their ability to act with a long-term perspective, regardless of changes in power in the United States, to be an advantage. Bogdan, in your opinion, how well are such positions and opinions, as expressed by analysts from the same Times publication, understood in Washington, so to speak? How do they view such prospects? And in your opinion, do you think the United States is capable of doing something, of somehow influencing the Russian Federation and making it clear to China that it could integrate into the world more than it does now, so that this cooperation would mean more risks than benefits for China?
Let's go step by step. First of all, of course, autocracies. And the system of governance that exists in China and in Russia, unfortunately, allows those in power to remain for a long period, where essentially elections are just a formal process for show. In China, one party is dominant and basically is the same in Russia. Similar models. This means that if we compare in terms of the criteria that really allow those in power to stay much longer, autocracies often offer such an option compared to democracies. Although it should also be noted that sometimes, even with democratic processes and elections, some leaders can also remain in power for quite a long time. Ms. Merkel was in office for many years, as those who remember know. Also, the current Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Rutte, he also led the Netherlands for quite a long time. But from the point of view of, again, the resilience and sometimes the resistance of the autocratic system, it means that it is much harder to change it from within, so to speak. That's why the bet is really on the fact that in the US, especially this year, after the congressional and Senate elections, the political landscape will change. And for Trump, I think it will be much more difficult to make decisions unilaterally on many issues, ignoring Congress and effectively ignoring the Senate. That's the first point. Second, regarding the relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping, to divide spheres of influence between the two of them. On the one hand, China is indeed interested in a more dependent Russia, not a stronger, but a more dependent one. And that Russia, which in China's view hurts the United States of America and the West in terms of their certain ambitions regarding the containment of China. For China, such a paradigm, such a tactic is beneficial. And against this backdrop, China demonstrates its pragmatism and willingness to communicate, its readiness to negotiate, at times showing a certain flexibility in diplomacy. But again, this is only for the time being. If the situation were to change, China could also alter its priorities regarding Russia, its support or lack thereof. The United States and Donald Trump have their own range of opportunities to influence, as you say, Russia. In other words, if this range of opportunities was so broad, they probably would have been able to exert more serious influence to prevent Russia from continuing this aggressive war. Thank you very much.